All right, good evening, everybody. My name's Dane Madrigal, and this evening I'm going to be presenting on Béla Bartók's Cantata Profana. So this is quite an interesting piece, and we're going to dive into it in just a bit, but I wanted to dedicate the first portion of this presentation on the life of Béla Bartók, as I definitely think that it is easy to look at a musician or a composer and not truly see them for the consummate person that they are. So this evening, I am aiming to be able to present Béla as a complete person, totally as like us, and also present his work in the most complete light possible. So let's go ahead and move on. So who was Béla Bartók? Well, Béla Bartók was born Béla Viktor János Bartók. He was a Hungarian, and he lived from the 25th of March, 1881 to the 26th of September, 1945. So Béla Bartók had a very interesting life, and it began at a very early age. And we're going to go into this in depth. So here we go. Childhood. So he was born in a Venetian town called, and please excuse me if I do not get this correctly, I'm not too adept at Slavic languages, Nagi Smitsklos. Anyway, this Venetian town was in the Kingdom of Hungary and now is in Romania. So if we look over here to this little map on the right side here, this red outline would have served as basically the borders of what we could have called Venetia. Now it's an amalgamation of different municipalities. You can see in the north is Hungary and on the west is Serbia, but mainly what takes up most of now Venetia's territory is Romania. Now, the specific town that we're talking about, Negesmniatkos, that's my best pronunciation of it, actually sits quite near the center of what was in Venetia. So you can see the different types of cultural influence and basically Baltic and Slavic influences that Béla would have already seen from an early childhood. And speaking of which, the diversity in his household was quite unique even at that time period. So his mother was a Southern Slovak. If we were to look at a larger map, right next to Hungary would be Slovakia above, and we will talk about that in a bit, but the mother being a Southern Slovak was not totally accustomed to this area in which Béla was born. The father was an ethnic Serb, so you can see that it would have been closer in proximity to the town that it was outlying it. But his father, on maternal side, actually had very strong German roots. And these German roots would be somewhat of an influence in Béla's life, but if anything, it was going to push him to be able to be more consummate as a cultural fanatic, and it would help grow his intrinsic disposition to love folk music, even from the Germanic tradition. But strangely enough, his father's mother was a German Catholic, which was a little bit atypical, if not extremely atypical for this time period, due to the Protestant Reformation and its centralization in Central Europe and especially in Germany. His father was actually also named Béla. So Béla Bartók that we know, even though we think of the only Béla, it was actually Béla Bartók II. So something interesting to think about for sure. If we go deeper into his childhood, his father unfortunately passed away at the age of 7. There wasn't really a cause of death given to this, but it was a very major event in Béla Bartók's life. The reason being because then his mother had to find a different means of income, and the best that she could do as a pianist was relocate back to her ethnic home area of the Southern Slavs. And at that period of time, the best place to go would have been Bratislava, which is now the capital of Slovakia. And if we look at this map here on the right, we can see that the Czech Republic is right here above it. Hungary is on the right, or down below, I mean, and then on the left is the Ottoman Turk, which would have been basically a municipality of a bit of the Austrian Empire that would have been under the control of the Ottoman Empire at that time. And we're remembering that this is pre-World War I period here, so there still were holdings, definitely, of the Ottoman Empire, not necessarily in the sense of a governmental province, but definitely as one that had a political reach. So something to keep in mind. Béla was definitely a gifted student, and in the sense that from a young age, he began to study music independently. So his formal teaching began at the age of 4, and it was when his mother started to give him formal lessons in Bratislava as part of her studio that she was running in the town at the time. But even before Béla started these lessons, he learned over 40 pieces, just so that way he could prove to his mother that he would be able to be a musician of a very high caliber. And it did take a bit of time before that he was allowed to be able to study, because at the time his father died, he was 7 years old. So by the time that he was now being able to get a hold on the piano would have been directly after his father's death, which must have been somewhat traumatic of a life incident. It might have put him off a few years. And a few years is a few years. And there's definitely no doubt that some of that time could have been put towards other compositional or performance activities, but it's not for us to look at it chronocentrically, but to just observe that it is something that most definitely influences early childhood music education. And speaking of which, he did suffer from a great amount of illness. There's some good records, actually, of not only the eczema, which was not terribly uncommon at that period of time, especially for people of the Baltic and Slavic regions, which for some genetic disposition do have struggle with skin and diseases and disorders more than other people's. But the smallpox, which is actually extremely interesting because he was actually a candidate for a experimental vaccine to help the smallpox. And when they gave him this vaccine, it totally erupted throughout his body, almost destroyed his immune system completely, and he became bedridden for over a year. So again, another setback in his early childhood music education that some people forget. But anyway, if we go into his early music education outside of his childhood, we see something very interesting. A descendant of Liszt. Why might we say this? Well, Béla was actually a student of Liszt. So people who enjoy tracking lineage of teacher and pupil would get a kick out of the fact that the two most famous Hungarian composers that we know today, Liszt and Béla, are actually in each other's family tree, which is something that's interesting. So after his high school education, he began to study music at the Royal Academy of Music in Bucharest, which is in Hungary, and he did this from 1899 to 1903. And it was there that he studied piano performance. He was not too much of a composer at that point in time, although he was composing. There was instances even of him giving recitals in Bratislava. And in such recitals, as an encore, he would perform one of the pieces that he would write. And some of these pieces even were based off of folk melodies at the time. So definitely already early influences that we would see carrying on through the rest of his career. But during his time at the Royal Academy of Music, it was definitely a formative era for him. So it was in 1902 that he met Richard Strauss, and he met Richard Strauss when Strauss was actually in Bucharest and he was getting ready to perform his consummate work, also Landschaftsoperrein, the Zarathustra piece that many people know now and love even outside of the world of classical music. But this meeting with Strauss set Béla on a trajectory actually for the first portion of his compositional career, not only to compose in the German school, but in the classically rooted German school that followed Brahms into Strauss rather than the Liszt Wagner tradition, even though, like we were talking about, Liszt was a Hungarian composer. But if we keep following this lineage, we see that Béla is actually an inheritor of it early on after this meeting with Strauss. And another very preeminent figure that he meets during his time at the Royal Academy of music in Bucharest was Zoltan Kodály. Kodály obviously is most famous for the Kodály method of music learning and music assimilation almost. And a brief overview of that is basically just the idea that the most common and most well-used tool for an early music education is the voice and exercise. A lot of focus on folk tunes of a native country, in this case Hungary, but as it's applied throughout the rest of the world, different cultures would use their own folk tunes to be able to not indoctrinate music, because that would be a poor term, but to be able to instill a good sense of music education and music appreciation. But outside of this early influence on Béla, that we're talking about, which definitely helped him to set him on a trajectory towards a folk music course, was that Zoltan Kodály would actually travel to Paris in 1907 and listen to some of Debussy's works. And he would actually bring back to the Royal Academy of Music many of Debussy's fully orchestrated scores from Paris, and Béla would actually study them quite consumingly. And it wasn't until a brief period of time between 1911 and 1918 that Béla's orchestrational and musical language would shift more from the Germanic school and into the school of the French thought, which is quite interesting. I also mentioned Lili Dosa in 1904. What one could argue is that this was the most important musical event in the entire life of Béla Bartók as we know him. And that's because this Lili Dosa, who is kind of just a name thrown under the rug to most people, was actually a Transylvanian nurse and childcare worker who Béla Bartók met when he was on a summer vacation in Transylvania, which is a portion of current Romania near the Black Sea. And he met this woman, Lili Dosa, who was actually taking care of a group of 6 to 7 children. And she was singing these Romanian songs that came from different musical and folk traditions. And Béla was just so encapsulated by this music that from that point on, he dedicated himself to becoming a comparative musicologist, which is what we would call today ethnomusicology or world musicology, depending on, well, the school of thought that you might come from, but also verbatim meaning different languages in that sense. But if we look more at his life, we see that he was married twice, first to Martha Ziegler, my apologies. And this Martha Ziegler that he married, he would be married to for about 6 years. And then in a, what some people might call unfortunate twist of fate, he had a young piano student, about 19 at the time, named Dita Pastori. And after a 6-month-long divorce, and then 2 months in between, he would marry this Dita. And then by these 2 women, he would have 2 sons, Peter and Béla III. Peter being the son of Martha, and Béla being the son of Dita. Dita, depending on the Slavic or Uric origin of the name, I'm not totally sure. Anyway, if we continue past this portion of his life, which would have been directly after, we look at he becomes an enemy of the regime. Why do I say this? Well, following his graduation from the Conservatory of Music, he actually became a concert pianist that would travel throughout Europe for about 4 years, 5 years. And then it wasn't until 1907 that he would then return to the Royal Academy of Music and work as a professor in piano studies, but he would also teach classes in harmony. And it was during this time there that he became more actively involved with political groups that were anti-fascist, and during some regime changes in Hungary at the time, especially between fascist groups, he became definitely an enemy of many, many peoples, and especially, most notably of all, the Nazi Party. One of his greatest friends from the conservatory there, whose name was Ulrich, was a Jewish man who he wrote many pieces for, and the people of the country basically asked him to disassociate himself from his friend because of this Jewish background, and this man had already fled because he had made so many enemies at the time in Hungary. And that's basically why Béla Bartók would eventually fled the country of Hungary, or flee the country of Hungary, I should say, with his second wife, Dita, and their son, Béla III, to the United States. And it would take them a long course of time to be able to receive his citizenship in the United States of America. He actually only got his citizenship 6 months before he died in 1945. And he died of leukemia in New York City at the age of 64. There were some signs that his life was coming to a close and his health was failing as he began to have muscles in his right arm stiffen on occasion. And this would just be the early signs, and it would continue to health progress, or digress, I should say, until eventually his death in 45. So definitely interesting historical figure as where he was placed in history and how it would generally affect his compositions. But specifically this evening, I want to look at the work, the Cantata Profana, with the subtitle Akelnek Kutsiodas, which is The Nine Enchanted Stags. So as we were talking about earlier in the evening, one of Béla Bartók's great fascinations was with folk music, especially that of the Hungarian region, which he would spend a good portion of his life teaching, and where he felt a good amount of ethnic heritage, though he belonged to a very diverse and large ethnic community groups. He would find the inspiration for many, many pieces, but the Cantata Profana would hold a very, very special place in Béla's heart. And as we'll talk about, he kind of decided that it was his credo. Credo in the Latin sense of I believe, that this was his statement, his intention of who he was as a person, as a consummate musician to the world, which is why I think it's such an interesting and unique work to look at. Although there are some other works that people are much more well associated with, such as the Violin Sonata, the Concerto for Orchestra, the Third Piano Concerto, each one of these also showing his latest and his last style of the combining of East and West in the sense of European cultures. So with that, I say that we take a deep dive into it. So we look at the background of this piece. There isn't a terrible amount of information actually about the intentions that Béla Bartók was having in relation to the piece that he was writing. Much of his work was actually commission work, especially from the people of Hungary, from the national arts associations, and also from places such as Massachusetts, where he would write his concerto from orchestra for the Boston Music Society at the time. What we do know about the Cantata Profana, though, is that even though it wasn't specifically meant for this, he entered this piece into the Hungarian National Arts Society Festival, and they did not much appreciate it. And in fact, for him, this was somewhat of a repeat, because during an earlier time when he wrote Bluebeard's Castle, his only opera, it became basically an ashamed piece for him. During this portion of time, the Hungarian people were so upriled by the fact that he was a supporter of anti-fascist regimes as opposed to liberty, that they just did not appreciate the works that he was outputting at the time. And so this deeply upset him, and it also became the reason for a large amount of time before it would actually become performed. So as you can see here, the finish of the composition was on the 8th of September, 1930. It was shown that it was completed in Bucharest, but it wasn't until around 4 years later in London, on the 25th of May, 1934, that it would receive its very first performance. Now, the very first performance was done by an English group, and it was done in English. And as we're going to talk about a little bit later, there might be not a problem with this, but there might be a little bit of a disconnect from maybe the original intentions that Béla had for this piece. Now, if we look at the actual piece itself, it scored for, excuse my poor English there, doubles mixed choirs. It's written for 2 mixed choirs and also for an orchestra. I have the orchestration over here on the right. And I will say that this piece is kind of interesting, that even though there is a few definitive editions of this, there actually are quite a few circulating, and they're all for purchase. It's very hard to find one of these scores basically for free online, but each one has a very different way of presenting the piece. The one that's closest is the Universal Edition, which actually uses the manuscript itself that Béla then had engraved in Hungary. And it also has probably the best edition of the text, along with foreword and whatnot. But that's kind of besides the point. If we get to it a little bit later on, if we have time, I'll touch on it, why that could be a little bit of a reason why sometimes it becomes problematic in performance of this work. But let's just jump right into the text. So the text he actually gathered from Romanian Colundi, I believe is how we say it, or Colunda. And Romanian Colundi were actually songs that Romanians sang, and it comes from the Transylvania region of what is current day Romania. And he found these Colundis that he actually put in as the text of this work in April 1914 during another visit to the Romanian countryside, when he was doing more of his ethnomusicological work and collecting many of the melodies that he was hearing throughout all of this portion of the world. And these 2 Colundis, well, I should preface it with this. Colundis are actually Romanian melodies that date from pre-Christian times, if you can believe that. The pre-Christian songs, these Colundis, then kind of got integrated into Christendom culturally, basically by turning them into nativity songs. But more likely than not, they had to do with traditional festivals that would have been held in small villages of Romania to celebrate different coming of the seasons. And you can see kind of the influence that this will have into this portion of the piece, especially the second portion, where we'll listen to some of the bits and I might point it out. But these Colundi become the story of the Cantata Profana. And the 2 that are most important are basically the story of a father who is talking to his sons, I should say, about what to do with their life. And I'll basically just tell you the story right now, because I think that it's very important to understanding the Cantata Profana. So like I said, there is a secular aspect to it, since that is the basis of the text, but there also is a sacred aspect to it, because it is meant to be representative somehow of the nativity in a certain sense. But if we talk about the actual story itself, it's about this father who's raising 9 sons, and the 9 sons are being taught by the father only one skill, only one craft, and that's to hunt stag. And what I will talk about a little bit after I finish the story is maybe the moral, but anyway, he teaches his sons only to hunt stags. And so one day when the father goes out away to do some type of miscellaneous work, the sons wander out into the woods to go hunting for stag. They cross over a mysterious haunted bridge in some versions of the story, but regardless, in the dark forest, and they get turned into 9 stags. When the father comes home, he's looking for his children everywhere and cannot find them, so he goes into the woods himself, and he finally comes across 9 stags in the woods, gathered around a mountain stream that are just simply drinking water. And immediately the father, as he'd been teaching his son, takes aims at these stags, and the biggest and most majestic of these stags looks at the father and begins to cry, and begins to try to communicate in the best way possible that it was his son. And in some miracle, and in the text and in the music as well, it's set to be more of a dialogue, but in the actual story, the father does realize that it's his son, and he starts pleading with all of them, and especially the eldest, to please come home and to please return to their mother and to him. And all that the stags have to say is that we can no longer do this. We can't hold cups. We can't go through doorways because of our antlers. And this is basically how the story ends. The story ends there. There's no bit about how the stags then integrate into the forest, or how the father and mother cope with the loss of their sons. And the interpretation is very interesting, because in the original context, some would argue that this is, a terrible story about people who were not taught all the lessons that they needed to learn to live a whole and fulfilling life. And because of this, they're doomed to live some type of existence that is, far beyond what we could even imagine as humans. And then on the other side of the coin, there's people who would argue that in the traditional telling of the story, that in some way and capacity, them being turned into stags somehow allows for them to ascend past what we might consider our mortal toils, and they now live a pure and carefree life where they get to drink from mountain streams and live with the foliage covering them and with nature. And so the interpretation is where Béla doesn't give us any hints. Béla decides that it's up to our interpretation at the end, but he does give some hints, and we're going to talk about that in the form. However, a brief side note, the process of the translation of this piece is kind of interesting, because when he went to Romania to take down these ethnographical works, since he was from originally a Romanian town and a Venetian town, he was able to speak Romanian and translated the Romanian into Hungarian, and then took the Hungarian to a trusted friend of his, whose name is slipping my mind at the moment, a German friend, who then translated into German. And since at that point in time, in not only Europe, but also throughout a good portion of the world, German was a consummate language that many, many people knew, because it was the language of economy and the language of trade. People were able to finally use this work. So that's why in many, many editions of the Cantata Profana, as I was talking about earlier, we'll have a German set of the language, a Hungarian set of the language, a Romanian set of the language, and an English set of the language. And in the Universal Edition, Béla Bartók's Romanian is actually there. It's his interpretation of the entire story inside. And it's really fascinating to look at, and I would strongly encourage you to read it to get his perspective on how the tale unfolds in the Hungarian tongue and how it's translated into English, which is even more important. Robert Shaw, even in 1955, would make a new English edition that is still used for many performances of it today when it's done in English in the United States. If we're looking at the form, this is where I was talking about. We get a more clear, clean, and crisp idea of what, Béla might have been thinking about the moral of the story. So the entirety of the piece is a very good look at palindromic arch form as it relates to works of the 20th century, and specifically of Béla Bartók, because this was definitely a form that he found himself using quite often, and usually to convey some type of story or narrative that was kind of, in a way, similar to sonata form, but in a very, very loose sense. Because if we look at the first movement, it's about the hunt and the transformation of the young sons as they go out into the wilderness. The second movement then sees the father's search, the confrontation between the two. And the third movement is kind of like the very last scene in a lot of Italian operas of the 1700s, where it's the morality scene. It can be seen as the epilogue or the recapitulation of the narrative. And it's through this very generous arch form for movements 1 and 2 that you see 8-minute durations, and the third movement in a 3-minute duration, which kind of gives it a lopsided tilt like Shostakovich 5. But what's most important about this is that you can see for Béla, maybe at the end when they're doing the recapitulation of basically the story, maybe it's not about the destination, but maybe about the process that the entire story went through. And maybe it wasn't so much about where it ended, but the humans that were damaged, the human emotions that were received as it goes through the middle. Because this was, composed at a point in time where the Depression had greatly hit Hungary. Many people were still trying to recover from the First World War, and though Béla didn't know it, fascism would soon be on the rise, and it would cause a tidal wave that would sweep across Europe and forever scar the history of the world. And I think this is definitely something important to think about, and how the form can definitely influence the narrative in a Beethoven, in an operatic Mozartian sense, and definitely, even in the 20th century, something not to forget about. So now time for more of a deep dive. We look at movement 1 of the Cantata Profana. Begins with Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Te, Do. So non-diatonic goes right in, and it sets a center, definitely, of pitch revolving around D, but definitely in a loose sense. I say Bach. Bach, why? Well, if we look at the score very carefully in the very opening, right after the first 4 bars, the entrances of the winds shows a very, very, very clear quotation of the very beginning of the St. Matthew Passion by Johann Sebastian Bach. So we think about this, maybe why did he do this? Why this quotation? To be honest with you, when I researched this, musicologists kind of did not have an answer to this. The most blatant one that I could see is that a cantata profana, even though the Passion is not a cantata in the broad sense, maybe in the specific sense of movements or a selection of movements, you definitely can see the interplay between sacred and secular. And I do believe that this might be the reason, but like I said, very, very broad, not totally consonant with the entire story itself, but it's a very, very clear quotation. And I will play for you now a portion of this piece of movement 1, only to know the hunt is what I say here. And it's because at the very beginning of this piece, well, the very first thing that we hear are the brothers that are about to talk about going on the hunt and starting the hunt and being into the woods. And this is kind of the mystery, the mist of the forest itself that we're about to hear. So let's take a listen. Here's the Bach. All right, so that gives you a good idea of the Bach there, and also a good portrayal of, the picturesque, in a sense, and very Gothic woods of the Romanian, Transylvanian countryside where this story is meant to take place, especially pre-Christendom, the primitivism that we're going to see in the second movement. But before we get there, we get a very short glimpse of this in a fugue that actually comes at the allegro portion, I believe, of the first movement. And this fugue is meant to emphasize the primitive nature of where the boys find themselves at, and right before their transformation into the stags themselves. So let's give a listen to this section. Vocal fugue. So right there, that gives you the idea of the primitive nature. And, if we put it into context, Stravinsky's Rite of Spring has already premiered at this point in Paris, and it's sent musical shockwaves throughout Europe. So you can definitely hear the sense of Stravinsky that's taking place in here. And I think what's also important to hear in Béla Bartók's orchestration is by this late period, you do have somewhat of a combination between the old German school and also the French Impressionistic school, and both thoughts of orchestration, Ravel and Debussy meeting Strauss and Brahms. And you can kind of hear it in the music, definitely, I believe. It's just definitely such an interesting combination, and to pair it with the vocal fugue and the primitive rhythms and ability for him to balance the orchestra the way that he does is just phenomenal. If we go on to movement 2, I say Father's Fugue, because he actually takes the subject from the fugue that we just heard in movement 1 through about, I'd say, a halfway point of that movement. And he takes that fugue and makes it into the Father's fugue in a sense. It's not actually a fugue, but it uses subject, like I said, to show the father calling out to the sons and saying, you know, where are you? Where are you? What? And then when he sees them, what have you become? Oh my goodness, what is this? And the son calls back to the father, and this is the tenor solo that we're going to listen to. And then right after the father and the son have this little bit of dialogue, and the son's pleading, you know, please don't shoot me for the love of goodness sake. There's a Greek influence that actually comes in, which is definitely antiquated. It's something that I didn't expect in the music. But instead of the father directly answering the son, the chorus in this sense, which does play a pretty big role in the narration of this entire story, just like in a Greek sense, but especially in this moment where the father has realized that these stags drinking from this mountain stream is his children, are his children. The chorus echoes, they're my children. And then the father has his moment in a baritone solo. And then we get into the plea and the reply. So if we listen to this little bit excerpt right here, we're going to hear the father's fugue, really just the father's subject, and seeing what's happened. So again, we see a little bit of the primitivism that's coming in, but that in this situation, there could be the argument made that it's more to the effect of the son's about to realize, oh my gosh, my dad's about to shoot me. So that is something to think about. If we move on, we're going to hear the son's cry here. And obviously remembering that this is a more narrative sense at this point in time, and that it's the son sharing, obviously, the dismay that he's about to have. So I think you get a good sense at that point in time. So basically, what we just heard once more time is we heard the son that's crying out in the tenor solo. Then we hear the tiny bit of chorus section that works as the Greek drama in a sense, announcing the father has now realized that these are his children. And then the baritone solo coming in saying, oh, wow, my kids are stags. And so we go on. The father's plea, this is basically the portion where we hear the father saying, please, please come back home. You're going to make your mother cry and die basically of despair. I will die of despair. And the stags, the eldest son, is answering very calmly, I cannot hold cup. I cannot go through the mantle of a doorway. This is where I belong. And I believe the way that he sets the music at this point in time gives a good illustration of how he interprets the story. So let's give a listen. So there you have the father's plea, and my apologies for that. I just realized I had played that for you in the previous slide just because I had forgotten to pause it at the incorrect moment. But just to elaborate a little bit more at this point, so the father's plea is just that little phrase, and obviously the entrances of the double chorus, even though it has 8 parts, is supposed to represent the 9 stags, and you get a good sense basically of the mood that's being set. It's very undertoned, it's very calm, especially on the part of the stags, and even the father who's pleading is kind of not a voice in the wilderness, but there isn't too much a sense of terrible sorrow, and I think it's because it's from the perspective of the stags. So definitely something to digest right there. And then movement 3, the epilogue of the entire story, a recapitulation of the narrative. It doesn't really matter what you want to call it. At the end of the day, it's just basically a summation, in other words. Durationally, though, very interesting, like I had mentioned before, you have these 2 big lumps of 8-minute section music that have big primitive and big orchestrational choices that butt right up against each other, and then itty bitty little 3-minute portion saying good luck at the end. It's an interesting choice formula standpoint, I guess is the word I'm trying to find there, but also an interesting choice from a narrative standpoint. I'll play a little bit of it for you, and I think that the third movement is kind of meant to be subjective in that sense. What you get out of it is kind of how you saw yourself in the story. Do you see yourself as the father? Do you see yourself as the stag? Do you see yourself as the narrative chorus? It depends, and I think that the third movement exemplifies this. So this undertone mood is what basically pervades the entirety of the third movement, which is why there's definitely a sense of narrative ambiguity, as I keep reinforcing. I would highly encourage you to listen to, if anything, just this last movement, even though all the fun's in the other ones. But you can definitely explore how the narrative formula is being subverted in this last movement. So I would definitely recommend this. I'm just cutting it a little bit short because I know I'm starting to run a little bit long at time. So we ask ourselves, what is the saliency of this piece? Why do we do a deep dive into the Cantata Profana when there's so many other fabulous works? Well, first of all, we talk about the Romanian tenor. And what do I mean by this? Not actually a Romanian tenor singing in this recording, no. So the song line, basically, at this point in time, kind of has the bel canto rattled throughout all of Europe. And if we think about a large picture, everyone is singing bel canto at this point in time. And we have people such as Verdi and Puccini who are in Italy that are just pumping out some of the greatest operas and the greatest arias that you can think of. And obviously, Béla is not oblivious to this. He is specifically choosing to use a Romanian antiquated style of melodic formulation called the horolunga. Now, something interesting and worth noting for sure is that Kodai and Béla together actually discovered in some of their early ethnomusicology, especially in the area of Hungary, that many of the scales that were deriving all of these folk melodies were pentatonic, and they were most similar with cultures that would have been found in Central Asia. And this makes sense because of the Huns and their influence in the area, hence Hungary. And it definitely is pervasive through a lot of the Baltic states, and it's something to think about. And horolunga itself was a tradition near the Black Sea in Transylvania, where he sourced many of this text and many of the melodies, and it definitely shows that he's trying to emulate that style of singing, and it makes it a very unique cultural heritage piece because it's probably the only piece of classical music that I can think of that very specifically utilizes this. So it's a way of preserving it that cannot be done in any other way other than through the recordings that he was doing, but also to integrate it as a standard almost into his compositions vocally. And we also say, you know, there's other works that resemble this contemporary in his repertoire. Works such as the Second Piano Concerto from 1930 to 31 in composition, or the Miraculous Mandarin from an earlier era of 1918, both that have orchestrational choices that resemble this, but each one of them that are kind of focused in one of the two schools, the Old German or the French Impressionist. And so there's no way to say that they're consummate with this work, which makes this even more salient, because it is stylistically removed from his only opera, and it is stylistically removed from his early piano concertos, his early string quartets and quintets, and removed from some miniature pieces that he was composing at the time too, as a part of his ethnomusicological work. And like I said earlier, this for him was a credo, and I believe where the East meets the West, and where comparative musicology is not just used for academia, it can be used also for the great example of the further continuation of Western art music. And I definitely think that this is lost in a certain sense, unless you consider symphonic works. If you think about the actual oral tradition of the transmission of song, which is something that goes on so many more times in millennium before we can even count, before the invention of instruments besides, you know, early membramophones or early flutes made out of bone carvings. And if we look into biomusicology and we look into evolutionary musicology, you know, I think if Béla, if Bartók was around today, he would be swinging into left field because of that, because this work is salient in the fact that it's a preservation of a culture that he knew and he loved, but it wasn't even his own. And he tried to make it a standard piece of repertoire, and especially if we know that he had it entered into music festivals at the time, and eventually had it performed by people who knew nothing about the Romanian culture or the Hungarian culture. I mean, I'm assuming because England, and also because the world was much larger at that point in time. And I definitely think it's easy to forget about that, as we've talked about throughout this class. the world was a much, much bigger place. And by the time fascism had hit Europe, the world was smaller. Cold War, smaller, smaller. And here we are in the technological age. We can get on our phones and we can go on Instagram, look up a guy from Hungary and start chatting with him, because universal language is now English. And even if it wasn't, there's Google Translate. And we could have a full conversation about Hungarian folklore. And actually, a total side note, but definitely something to check out, is Hungarian folk tales on YouTube. They're very cute and they're very fun to watch, and they're definitely really entertaining because they give you almost an entire history of Hungarian culture that are in the cartoon format, and they use traditional Hungarian music in them as well. So definitely something maybe if you want to check out. And like I said, another salient point, uniqueness. You know, like I said, Bluebeard's Castle, opera. Unique? Yes, his only opera. This, his only double choral work for orchestra, and one that is using all of his ethnomusicological research up until this point. And like I said, something that is trying to further Western art music and still rooting it in tradition while pushing it up. Something I think is almost incredible, really. Just absolutely incredible. So if we take this as a whole as to what we should be getting out of this, what I should have done from the beginning was promise you that you would definitely learn that Béla Bartók was a consummate artist. But what we should take away from this is that this work and this artist was a consummate musician, and he worked his entire life, not necessarily for any monetary gain, because it is a myth that he died, you know, dirt poor. He made a lot off of royalty and commission fees for many of his other works, even though he wasn't even a member of ASCAP in the United States when he finally emigrated here to escape from the Nazis. We should take into mind that this was a musician who dedicated his life works for the preservation of culture, which is something that sometimes not necessarily lost, but I definitely think when we consider the modern field of musicology, sometimes it's rooted in academia. And Béla Bartók was just rooted in humanism, is what I would say. And what we should take away from the Cantata Profana is that it might be the greatest work of the early 20th century that was geared towards the preservation of not only a tradition of Western art music that derived from a very small ethnic group of people that lie on the west of the Black Sea, but it was also the preservation of a culture and the preservation of a long-standing tradition. And I think that's what we should take away from this. Regardless, though, thank you so much for listening. I hope that you guys enjoy the rest of your evening. And I will stop recording.